Hi, Mike. Thanks for coming all the way from Brighton. How are you?
I'm fine, Ramsey, and it's really good to be up here.
Yeah.
I don't think I've been up in Letchworth for many a year, decade.
Oh, so
actually.
you've been to Letchworth before?
In my misspent youth, I think I was going to the Nebworth Festival.
Right.
I think that would have been 78.
Right.
And I think I got off the train here.
Yeah. So
I
you
don't think
remember you remember it. That's a good thing.
Well, yes, I kind of remember it. I think Genesis were headlining, Devo was support, and for reasons I won't go into at the moment, I can't remember much of it. But I was young.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about yourself. You're an academic.
I'm kind of semi-retired now.
Yeah.
I've worked probably all in all about 30 years or a bit less than that, in the academic world, in the UK and overseas, mainly in various different parts of the Middle East, also with some consultancy type work in the Far East. And my initial preparation was in languages and literature, so I did comparative literature. And when I was working overseas, there was a big movement to reform or develop the education system.
In the Middle East, where exactly?
This was in the Gulf.
In the Gulf.
This was in United Arab Emirates, and then after that in Bahrain.
Right.
There was a big move to sort of try to shift towards post-oil, post-hydrocarbon economies. The degree of urgency, because a lot of the money had been squandered. In the case of Bahrain, there was a report, I think by McKinsey consultants in the early 2000s. They said, look, you're going to run out of oil really quickly. Right. So we need root and branch reform of the whole education system, from kindergarten to PhD. So what they were trying to do was sort of move away from quote unquote traditional learning towards something that's more flexible and dynamic and student-centred. Yeah.
And so you were hired to help them in this respect?
No, I was originally out there really just to do academic comparative literature.
Right.
But I'd acquired a little portfolio of academic, of professional qualifications in higher education, teaching and learning. And, it was a little bit like, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So I ended up quite senior positions out there. And I came back in 2011 following, well, we'll probably talk about that later, but certain events related to the, quote unquote, so-called Arab Spring.
Right.
And came back, and I was sort of practicing in higher education in the UK in various different roles. I worked at one point for UCL's Institute of Education with international consultancy.
Yes.
And I'm kind of semi-retired now. I do a little bit of academic work, but I'm really trying to sort of orientate myself towards writing in various different genres, sort of informed comment, journalism, various kinds of creative writing, and hoping that in my borderline dotage, I can make a viable career out of doing that.
Right. Okay. Let's rewind a little bit back, all the way back. So how did you get into your academic career?
It's an interesting question. I entered higher education when I was in my late 20s,
right,
as a mature student, because I dropped out of sixth form in the mid-70s for punk, which is another story. And the way things were going with, at that time you still had student grants, and it was, fairly generous support. And there was rumours going around that this is all going to stop, and replaced by loans. And since I was already nearly 30, I thought, it's now or never. So I did modern languages and literature, and majored in Arabic.
So you speak Arabic?
إلى حد قليل.
إلى حد قليل. Very good.
صعب شوي أمام الكاميرات.
Yes. To some extent, you said.
Yeah.
Right. And so you did your undergrad.
Yeah.
Which was in?
It was languages and literature.
Right.
It was a 4-year degree, because you get to do a year overseas immersion experience, which I did at the American University in Cairo.
Right.
And
you went to Cairo.
Yeah.
How did you find that?
Really interesting. It was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, because I'd travelled around various locations in Europe. I'd never been in a place like that at the time. This was the year I was there was 91, 92. And there was a lot of changes going on at that time. The political system was very, very ossified.
Ossified.
Very,
with Mubarak in power.
This is about midway through Mubarak.
And this is purely to study the Arabic language.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you must have Egyptian dialect.
I've kind of lost that, because I spent 10 years in the Gulf.
Oh, right.
I can follow it. If I was chatting away with Egyptians in the room, it would probably come back to me. I always find the hard Jeem.
Yes, the infamous
Gamal. Abdel Nasser. I always find that slightly hard.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a joke, actually, when I was teaching in the Gulf. We were looking at different dialects and different pronunciations, and I was one of the strange things is Arabic people say, non-Arabs, Western people always find certain letters difficult to pronounce, like the ain and the
that's
glottal stop and stuff.
Impossible for some.
But in my natural speech is London speech, and you have like the glottal stop in there, like bottle and butter.
Yeah.
Know what I mean? And that's, they've already got that like Hamza sound.
Yeah.
So all you just have to intensify it to make quite a nice ain out of it.
Yeah.
And so I was saying this thing about how in Egypt calf gets like a glottal stop.
Calf. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Endi Alamfir Adami Qadmi. I've got a pain in my foot.
Say that again. Endi
Alam for Adami for Adami for Qadm.
Yeah.
And so I said, I wrote this word up in Arabic, and I said, right, okay, try saying this in an Egyptian accent. And the word I wrote up was haqa'iq, okay, with the female possessive, so it would be haqa'iqaha.
Yeah.
And they go, and so I used to use that as an icebreaker.
Non-Arabic speakers will not know what we're talking about.
I digress.
But it's fascinating. Arabic is one of the great pleasures of the world, the Arabic language, especially the script and the calligraphy and the way it sounds. What were your first impressions of Cairo?
It's again, really interesting, because I'd never been to a similar kind of place before, and I was there to do something serious, study. And in all honesty, when I first turned up there, I was hanging around just off of Meydan Tahrir, and it was so busy and so noisy and so dusty.
Yes.
And practically everybody you see tries to rip you off.
Yeah.
And it was just, oh my God, I thought, I was trying to think of 1,001 excuses to
leave.
To leave and drop out of
Well,
this.
Dusty is the polite version.
I was being polite,
Yes.
I was thinking, because at that time the AUB was, the American University in Beirut was, I think it was off, they weren't doing year abroad placements.
Right.
So anyway, I thought, if only we'd gone to Beirut, this whole cliche about, water skiing and skiing in the mountains and everything else. I'm in the middle of Cairo. And I thought, oh my God, this place is hellish.
In Beirut?
No, in Cairo.
Oh, yeah.
I think I was saying, why couldn't we have gone to Beirut?
Right. Okay.
How good it would have been if we were in Beirut.
Yeah.
But after I did about a year there, and when it came time to leave, I became really, oh my God, I've got to go home. Oh, this place felt like, the city felt like, I don't know, a bit like a kind of comfortable old shoe. It had seen better days. It had perhaps been lived in too long.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was like homely and nice, and I was happy and comfortable and relaxed there. I'd been back to.
It does get. It can get super, super comfortable for.
Yeah.
What's the word? I was going to say expats, but I don't like that word. For Westerners, should we say, or international people, it can get. There are two levels of Cairo. There's more than two levels, but there's the huge underclass of people. Then there's the state class, and then there's the internationals.
I had rented to. Firstly, I was in Al-Muhandisin, which is those districts named after professions.
Yes.
And then
the engineers in
the
English.
engineers district, and then
it's fun. I spent time in Damascus. This was before the war, and it was in a district called Bab Tuma, which is St. Thomas's Gate, and it's where the Christians are. And it's the old town. It's the most historic part of Damascus. Damascus being the most continually inhabited city in the world, along with Jericho. And it was a lot of fun because people who actually go out and have fun, they're kind of a small circle of people. So you get to bump into the same people over and over again, and it becomes like some kind of 19th century novel or something.
Yeah, that's kind of what it was like. After Muhandisin, we moved to Al Maadi, which is down on the metro line in the south, and that was totally different. That was built, I think, initially as a home from home for sort of British military officers and administrators during the occupation. So it's got these like little windy, very, very, very Middle Eastern, like little windy lanes and
right.
And it's quite a posh neighbourhood, but we didn't have any problem affording that either, and then you'll go back into town, but people will come over and of course everyone said, you must show me the pyramids, and I was never really interested in that stuff. I was interested in the medieval history and the modern history.
Because you did your PhD in 19th century Egypt and the British in Egypt, is that right?
Yeah. My PhD was on the comparative literatures of the British occupation of Egypt, 1882 to 1956.
Wow.
With a sort of focus really on the interwar period where you have various different strands of Egyptian nationalism emerging. You have the rise. You'll have the Waft party, the sort of like, and we even within the Waft, you have this division between what you might think of as a sort of Mediterraneanist Egyptian nationalism. So it's like Alexandria, it's facing out across the Mediterranean towards Greece and Italy, and in that sense, very much associated with Taha Hussein, who I think was Minister of Education at one point.
Because Yeah.
The Egypt and Europe are essentially, two sides of the same coin.
Interesting.
And then you had this more kind of nationalism of the unity of the Nile Valley, that Egypt, it ends up in the Mediterranean, but it's not essentially a Mediterranean country. It's an African country, with roots in, almost the beginning of civilization. That was often associated with the movement for sort of unification between Egypt and Sudan. And then you would have the beginning of various, what would now be called Islamist movements. And of course, after or during the war, you have the beginnings of the Free Officers movement, which eventually deposed the Allied monarchy. So it's really, really interesting. So you look at how that's represented in, sometimes it's represented quite directly.
Yeah.
So, for example, in Mahfouz's trilogy, you have characters who quite plainly represent different political trends, and they all sort of talk about it in the course of their interactions. In other literatures,
Mahfouz, of course, being the Nobel Prize-winning author.
Najib Mahfouz.
Naguib.
Naguib. Oh, yeah, I go. There I go. It doesn't come naturally. In fact, even when I was there, it didn't. There were some friends of mine. I had some Egyptian friends up in Alexandria, and they pronounce the Jim up there, and there's a couple of other specifically Alexandrian things, and they'll say, no, when we're down in Cairo, I have to be careful to do the hard Geem, because if not, the cab drivers will rip us off shamelessly.
Oh, yes.
Because
they'll
they
do
realise
that
we're
anyway.
from out of time.
They'll do that anyway. But Arabs, they speak each other's dialects. Most Arabs do. And I have Kuwaiti friends who speak to me in my dialect, and then when they switch to their dialect, I'm like, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, that's definitely, there's that, what was called in linguistics, code switching.
Yeah, code switching.
Between
languages and dialects.
And levels as well, sort of socio-linguistic levels.
Right, yes.
I remember one time I was in this flat, I think that was the one in Al Muhandiseen, and I was writing a short essay, I think it was on political economics in Arabic, with all the dictionaries, specialist dictionaries I bought, and there was a knock on the door, and it's this Saidi person, Falah guy.
Peasant.
Sorry, with his scarf around his neck and all the rest of it, no teeth, and he mumbled something to me that was completely incomprehensible. I didn't know what on earth he was saying.
Right.
And then I looked down, and he was a Labanji, who sells like milk and yogurt, and he just knocked from door to door.
Yes.
And I thought, that's really weird, because here's me writing something relatively sophisticated, and I can't communicate with the milkman.
Oh.
So that's what my doctorate was in. And then
my mum once woke up and she found a woman looking straight at her, who wanted to sell her, I don't know, goodness knows what, fa'us or whatever. But that was unusual. Usually they don't go into people's houses, but in that instant, this was in the 1980s. In that instant, my mum kind of opened, and it's like saw this woman looking at her. Right, would you like some courgettes?
We weren't well off at all. I was on a student grant, and I didn't have loads of money, but we made terrible faux pas. So, for example, I'd never been in a position where, one has a servant. So there was this Bawab, who's sort of
gatekeeper.
Technically a gatekeeper, but kind of a fixer and an odd job man. And if you want something done, he knows where to do it and all the rest of it. Sort of some of them are kind of like sort of hustlers and who lived literally lived in a cupboard under the stairs. I didn't know that at the time, so I thought it'd be nice. And I picked up on the way in at the airport, I thought, a few gifts will be handy. So I picked up this bottle of, gave him this bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label, and I said, "Here, look, you have that." And he's like, looking at me like I was mad, not out of any religious scruples, because I wasn't religious at all, but simply that I just handed over this, like, incredibly valuable item that he could.
Does he drink or?
He sell it to someone. I did, I suppose.
Oh, right, that's interesting. It's unusual. I mean, I used to go drinking in Bab Tuma in the Christian district. There was no questions asked. It was totally okay. And drinking in the Arab world, Arab and Muslim world, that can be a funny one, or at least misinterpreted.
It's a strange one. I mean, you obviously get people who are very, very pious and very, very observant, for whom alcohol's grossly offensive. But I mean, my
people forget that not all Middle Easterners are Muslim.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So that's the first point.
Absolutely. Cairo, for example, has significant Coptic population.
From my father's side,
Greek. Greek, Arab.
Grandfather's side, maternal grandfather's side. Sorry, that was it. Yeah, go on.
And so people forget that because there's a lot of cliches and stereotypes. And also, I think it depends on which country you're in, and again, there's a social class element to it. And you've had this whole pietist Salafi movement that's been
the Salafis. They're a religious movement that developed in Arabia about 250 years ago, something like that.
With
in the 18th century.
18th century, originally sort of in opposition to the Ottomans, and then you had turn of the 18th, 19th century. You had a number of quite significant thinkers, Muhammad Abdul, who is not thought of as a Salafi now, but he kind of
who is
he was a big religious. Muhammad Abdul.
Okay, not sure who he is.
Rashid Rida, who I think he might have been Syrian, but he was resident in Egypt. So that whole pietist movement, was seen, I think, after the collapse of Islamic socialism, if you like, Ishtirakiyat al-Islam.
Yes, sort of cooperative historica,
which was kind of promoted by Nasser, but it all ended up with corruption and things.
Right.
A lot of the pietists come to sort of take their place as an oppositional movement and did lots of good works, running hospitals out of mosques. The
Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt with Benna.
Of course, Is
that 1920s, I think?
That starts 1920s, a slightly different tendency.
Yes.
So that's significant. That's significant, and it's kind of significant about perhaps the sort of what I could call the sort of, upper working class, lower middle classes. And of course, people like that would be, very offended at the thought of, offers of alcohol and stuff like that. Elsewhere, I mean, for different social classes, different countries and things, the impression I get, it's like, I don't know, the same way that, I'll use a cliche here, the same way that, I don't know, Catholics would think about masturbation. Just
it's very good.
Just say a couple of prayers or something, and that's that one. It's
very good.
Hail Marys, but
I found Muslims to be a very respectful and non-interfering when it comes to drinking alcohol. They know that you're not a Muslim, and it's not even an issue. Christians do their Christian thing, and Muslims do their Muslim thing, and it goes back all the way back to the Prophet. But not only that, also the millet system in the Ottoman Empire, where each denomination had their own courts and their own system.
The rabbinical court, for example, and I think there were populations within a city where clerical courts, church courts would have held sway over at least certain legal issues. Not everything, but things like perhaps property, inheritance, divorce, that kind of thing.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say there's a tendency for people to, frown a little bit because of the light.
Oh, yes.
So if you can avoid doing that.
Okay. It's
I do it too when I forget. But I thought I'd mention it.
It's my inner vampire. The light, take the light away.
It's it's 500 watts, so it's not the most powerful light, but it can be a little bit in your eyes. Okay, right, brilliant. So let's talk about the canal and how that got built and why, and everything about the canal in Egypt.
It was an old, as I gather, it was an old project that had been sort of hypothesized going back to, I don't know, the time of the pharaohs and time of the Romans, but it never quite been done. I think under the Mamalik they had a scheme to do it, but it never happened either. And Muhammad Ali Pasha, who was ruler of Egypt after...
The famous ruler of Egypt.
Your original enlightened despot.
Yes. Who created the modern state of Egypt, essentially.
Albanian origin.
Albanian, yes. Famously, I think, invited people to a banquet and killed all his rivals.
The Mamluks, the rival Mamluks. This is after the British had thrown Napoleon out around the turn of the 18th, 19th century, and he consolidated his power and founded this dynasty. And did, in his own way, some pretty amazing things. I mean, Egypt was sort of opening up and beginning to industrialise in a similar way that probably Japan was at the time,
Yes.
He had lots of scholarship programmes initially to France and then later to Britain and Italy. He had a big translation house. Lots of beginnings of sort of infrastructural projects and stuff like that, and he had quite a long reign. I think it was late 1840s he died.
Right. Yes.
And his successors carried on.
He was also good with the. Sorry to interrupt. He was also good with building up a kind of modern military.
Absolutely, under the influence largely of Bonapartist officers, the Bonapartist officer corps after Waterloo and the return of the Bourbons. A lot of them went to work for Muhammad Ali Pasha in Egypt. Well, at certain times he threatened at one point the Ottoman possession of the Hijaz and of the Sham. At one point, even the continued existence of the Ottoman Empire itself.
So there was an Operation Paperclip in Little One in Egypt. They took on. So there were the people who came to colonize, and then he took them on, co-opted them, and formed the modern state.
Because of course, obviously, they would have been unemployable in the French military.
Why is that?
Because they were Bonapartists. After the 100 days, in the officer corps, there was a huge cult of loyalty around Napoleon.
Yes.
And a lot of those sort of marshals, generals, military engineers, people who were involved in military training, were known to be very strongly Bonapartist loyalists. Maybe less so people who were captains or colonels or something because they were younger and they had their careers ahead of them. So a lot of these people went off to work for Muhammad Ali Pasha over in Egypt to help him develop his military.
Because there was Napoleon Bonaparte and then there was Napoleon III. But there's a bit in between I'm not very familiar with.
This is the Bourbon Restoration.
The Bourbon, okay.
Yeah, during the Bourbon Restoration. The return, if you like, of the Ancien regime.
I didn't know they returned. Okay,
yeah.
Okay.
It didn't last very long and they weren't very popular.
Right, okay.
So it was in that period. It was in that period.
In French, whenever you say you call someone a Bourbon, it's the ultimate insult.
Yeah.
Especially if it's the president of France.
Perhaps understandably so. So there were these people there. And the Muhammad Ali's successors were looking at Grand Projet and so you had the opera house and you had all this kind of thing. And under a degree of pressure from the French, they embarked on the canal, digging the Suez Canal.
Right.
And the French interest was they could then rival the British with access to the Far East.
Yes. Because Ferdinand de Lesseps was the architect for the canal. So how did the British get involved?
Because the British wouldn't have it. The British can't if you're digging this thing, you can't have it. And the Egyptian government by that time had more or less bankrupted itself on projects, and so British finance capital come in. They probably had more money available, so they had a kind of joint ownership with the French. To underline the point, the Royal Navy bombarded Alexandria in 1882, and Egypt then continued under British occupation.
A gunship diplomacy, as they say.
Battleship diplomacy.
Because
I mean, there wasn't a lot left of the old part of Alexandria by the time they finished. Even people in the British side, were saying this is barbaric. You shouldn't have done that. It's over the top, And it kind of like set the tone for the occupation, and a little bit perhaps like Iraq, that sort of, what was it called? Shock and awe.
Right.
So that was the idea. You bombard Alexandria with these battleships, knock the fight out of the Egyptians, then you occupy and they'll be scared of you and they'll do what you like. But obviously it doesn't work like that because nobody likes that having that happen to them. So it builds up, grievance, and quite rightly so, builds up grievance and resentment.
Anti-colonial movement.
So Ferdinand de Lesseps was Cairo's. Was Nasser's code word. I think he was doing a speech in Alexandria, and the Egyptian army would occupy the canal zone. His code word to go ahead with the operation is when he says in his speech, Ferdinand de Lesseps.
Oh, that's so interesting. That's brilliant. Of course, Egypt was the first country in Africa to decolonize. It became semi-independent in the 1920s.
Yeah.
And that spearheaded the anti-colonial movement.
It was a very, very complex history because the British, it was a quite different model of colonialism to, say, the French. I mean, there are places that the British certainly colonised. I mean, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and so on and so forth. And then they got kind of various different levels of control. So, for example, what's now the Gulf states are all protectorates. About a third of India was the princely states where local emirs or maharajas, depending on what religion they were, ruled on behalf. All that kind of stuff. Then there were countries that become economically dominated by Britain, but were never formally part of the empire. Iran and Argentina, of course, come to mind. So up until the First World War, Egypt was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire. Nominally part of.
Yes. But with a British occupation.
De facto ruled by the British.
Yes.
And it got to the stage that the Alid, the dynasty from Muhammad Ali, the Alid, I can't remember which one it was now, but anyway, he, with the First World War, it became too much of a contradiction, even to the British, to have something that was de facto part of the British Empire, but de jure part of the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
So their solution to that was we will, because he was Khedive, viceroy. So the British said, I tell you what, we will make you sultan.
Yes.
And you cut your ties with the Ottoman Empire because we can't have that because they're our enemies. We're fighting them in Gallipoli and Mesopotamia. So we'll make you sultan. And then I think the one after him became Malik, king. Yeah. And so then it was a kind of highly compromised independence, and that's when obviously Egypt was kind of massively reoccupied during the Second World War, the Desert War.
Right.
which again
Yes.
exacerbated those quite legitimate grievances,
Yeah.
which led to Egypt being at the forefront
Of the anti-colonial movement again.
Because if you go back in time, I mean, people kind of we tend not to say the third world now. We tend to say the developing world or emerging markets or something. But
At the time, it wasn't, and even now, it wasn't an offensive term because it meant non-aligned. So it was the first world, America, second world's Russia, USSR, and third world was the non-aligned world.
It became sort of synonymous at one point with poverty and underdevelopment. Oh, it's like the third world out there.
Yeah.
But it didn't mean that at all. And I think the founders were Suharto's Indonesia, Nasser's Egypt, and Tito's Yugoslavia. And it was there were those countries that were not aligned either to the West or to the Soviet Union. And so that's where that whole third worldist movement, I think Nasser had this idea of, what was it, 3 circles? It was the Arab world, the Muslim world, and the colonized world. The rest of the world that wasn't Arab, wasn't Muslim, because the Muslim world is obviously bigger than the Arab world, and the rest of the colonized world is even bigger.
And of course, he was right at the centre.
And he was
personally.
right at the centre, personally right at the centre. Jamal Abdel Nasser.
He was a charismatic figure. They call him an Arab radical. But ultimately, he didn't succeed.
Well, what succeeded him after Sadat was with that whole thing of like the military in suits, the military in business suits.
Yes.
Of Mubarak and all the stuff that lasted up until 2011.
Yes, and that brings us right square to Bahrain.
Okay, sure. But if I go back a little bit before that, because I before I got involved in higher education development, I was doing comparative literature, and you had I started off as assistant professor, and then I was associate professor. So when you get these professorial titles, you're supposed to do like an inaugural lecture or something. So I said, okay. I adapted something for my PhD, and it was about the different kinds of emergent Egyptian nationalism resistance movements in the middle of the 20th century, for middle third, say, of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And how that related to the literatures at the time, and this was all quite fresh in my mind because I'd finished my doctorate about a couple of years before. And, to my astonishment, it went down like an absolute, if I can lapse into the colourful vernacular, an absolute shit sandwich. Because it went,
Trying to imagine that.
It was borderline. I was going to be like sent back home again,
right?
And I thought, what did I do wrong? It's well researched. I'm not taking an ideological position on it myself. The Gulf states, they import a lot of their professional class. Well, they import their working class from South Asia, Southeast Asia. They import a lot of their professional classes from the wider non-oil rich Arab world. Certain people they borderline oppress Palestinians and that. I mean, they can do all right money wise out of it, but under I thought, well, what and it turned out that even though the Gulf states behave like that, and even though they're essentially extractive.
Yes.
Yeah. To the detriment of the wider Arab world.
Yes.
They still adhere to this Arab nationalist ideology on the surface level.
Sathi, which means ceiling.
On the surface level.
Surface.
Yeah, on the surface. On the surface level. They still adhere to this as part of their sort of pan-Arab credentials, particularly in, at that time, official government discourse.
Oh, I see.
And the thought crime I'd committed, the university authorities, obviously the universities out there are much closer to the government than they tend to be here, say. was that I had reminded people, as if they didn't already know, that there were other kinds of anti-colonial movements with different political and different social and different economic agendas. There were, left-wing and communist ones. There were liberal ones. There was, in the case of Egypt, your Mediterraneanist wafdism and your Nile Valley wafdism. And it wasn't all, Jamiat al Arabiya and all the rest of it. It wasn't the Arab League. It wasn't all that. And apparently that represented a kind of thought crime, because they got
Unfortunately, in that part of the world and many other parts of the world, politics is a very tricky issue, and people pay high price for talking politics. Which is a real pity. But then there's a whole background to that, historical, economic, political background behind that.
Well, to digress, and I have no sympathy, and I am not going to in any way apologise for it, it's simply an explanation. I have no sympathy for Saddam or for either the Iraqi or the Syrian versions of Baathism. But at the time of the first Gulf War, I made this, why has he invaded Kuwait? Saddam is evil, he's this, that and the other. I said, well, look at it. Just imagine the boot was on the other foot. Just imagine that, the British Isles were, part of the developing world and historically had been colonised by much more powerful Arabs. And when it was becoming an important resource, North Sea oil was discovered. And European people would say this is Europe's oil. British people might say this is Britain's oil. Scottish people might say this is Scotland's oil, which is the early SNP slogan. But these hegemonic Arabs come along from Baghdad and Cairo and went to a laird of a tiny little Scottish island with a tiny population, and said, tell you what, this is your oil. It's not Scotland's oil. It's not Britain's oil. It's not Europe oil. It's your family's oil. All you need to do is let us take it out the ground for you cheaply.
It would have helped if there was a vote if the Kuwaitis had voted. I seem to remember that I think there was a green light from the Americans to invade. According.
I think the invasion was wrong. It's just it's the context to it. It's why. It's why the non-oil-rich Arab world would have a grievance against what they saw as neo-colonial principalities.
Right, of course.
And then once you start talking about other forms of resistance to colonialism other than the official ideology, then you're, as I found myself, you find yourself in surprisingly hot water. I mean, I thought of this as like, it's just.
But what did they do exactly? They just sacked you? Is that...
No. They just had firm words with me.
Oh, right. Okay. On that occasion.
But there are certain sensitivities, isn't there?
Yeah.
So after that, I thought, okay, I'll just stick to literature.
You're not allowed to think.
Well, it's odd. You are allowed to think, but they see, this is what they want. You see.
Yeah.
What they want.
Yeah. Go for it.
Because with what I was saying about reforming the education system and using the education system to diversify the economy away from hydrocarbons. You need to have people who, think laterally, think out the box, are comfortable communicating across cultures. But the idea was that could all be safely confined within certain areas, So, for example, literature. It's safe to talk about these things purely as literature, or film studies. It's safe to talk about them purely as film studies, or even international relations. You can critically analyse international relations as long as you don't talk about here.
Of course,
because ultimately all those higher education reform movements were instrumental in the top down from the sheikhs, because they. The impetus for it was purely economic. What the hell are we going to do when we run out of hydrocarbons? What they didn't realise, or not realise, what they underestimated, I think, is the extent to which if you provide students with that kind of education, and the existing education system, certainly in the Gulf, wasn't, then you're going to engender certain sets of social expectations, of political expectations, of economic expectations.
Of course.
In all kinds of ways. I mean, for example, female higher education. I mean, humanities and social sciences in the Gulf are probably, depending on what subject area exactly and where, were, at least 50% female.
Right,
sometimes a lot more.
Yeah.
Because the guys would go to study something serious like engineering or business or something. Whereas this was having a university degree would enhance a woman's mahar.
One point about acceptable discourse is that, of course, the same principles apply here in the West. There are gatekeepers, and essentially a journalist's job is to determine the parameters for acceptable discourse. If you go outside the parameters.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not taking the claims of Western political, particularly British at this time, UK political media discourse, at face value, or pretending that we in that way are somehow superior or more advanced. Au contraire, it's more that if anything, it's like this country's going in the direction of that you see in certain parts of the Middle East and certain parts of Africa.
Never
and Asia.
thought anyone would say that, but. It's there's been a regression, hasn't there, in recent years?
Very much so.
And it's worrying when people don't even realise that there's been a regression.
Well, the other day, I think it was, I think Sunak's 5 points he wanted to emphasise. I mean, he's just really trying to manage chaos, minimise Tory losses. But the first 4 were kind of like sort of big picture economic, very, very safe bets, because some of them for international reasons are likely to happen anyway, whatever he does or doesn't do. But the last one of the 5 was cross-channel crossings. And leaving aside for a moment the humanitarian aspects to it, it's hardly the scale of the problems that the country faces. It's hard to imagine anything more irrelevant and unimportant to not to the people making the crossings, but to the big economic picture. It's a complete distraction.
Yes.
Complete distraction.
Yes.
So you start to feel like you're...
And the numbers I saw in a graph, I hope someone will fact check me on this, the numbers haven't actually gone up very much. It's just that the funding, and there's been lack of funding and mismanagement, which is why it takes longer to process the claims.
Yeah, and all sorts of other things, because there is this reciprocality, you see, with the UK and the Gulf states. Yeah,
right.
It's like they wouldn't exist, really, frankly, without the British. In the sense that, I don't know, the oil would belong to Oman or Iraq, or basically they wouldn't have these little emirates.
Yes,
and
because the Bahrain is claimed, I think, by the Iranians.
There's an ongoing claim. There was a plebiscite in the mid-70s. Did it want to become? Was it the 17th, I think, province of Iran? Or did it want to exist as an independent Arab state? And it was, I can't remember the stats, but it was a majority in favour of being an independent Arab state.
Yeah.
But that tension was always there.
Yeah. But the British were there for a long time to protect against piracy. Also, it's claimed.
They initially it was there to suppress piracy in the Indian Ocean because of Britain's presence in India initially, and then obviously
with the East
it
India
developed.
Company.
In fact, the Gulf states, if I remember correctly, at the height of British imperialism, the Gulf states were administered from New Delhi. In the very similar way to how they would have administered the princely states in India. In fact, the princely states in India are probably the model, whereas other parts of the Middle East that ended up being colonized or economically dominated by Britain, the British Empire, tended to be administered from Cairo. So there were two different offices. There were two.
I didn't know that.
With conflicting agendas. There was an occupation. The office that dealt on the ground, and there would be a London office. Yeah, the office that dealt on the ground was based in Cairo, and it reported to, I can't remember. It wasn't the India office. It was. I don't know.
Yeah.
But they had conflicting interests. That comes to the fore in the First World War. It would like who would send which troops to where. We want some Indian troops to go here. No. You know. So it's a very complex history, and I think there is that kind of reciprocality between Britain and the Gulf states. I mean, you see it with the practice of stripping people of citizenship, you know, which happens out in the Gulf for a very, you know, really quite minor dissent, writing an anti-regime poem or something, you know, strips such a person of their citizenship.
It's
and then you saw it here, you know, with people who did or who were alleged to have support ISIS. Obviously,
what's her name?
Time for Shamima Begum, who arguably was trafficked by Western security services.
Yes, that came out, didn't it?
Yeah.
That should have made headlines, but it wasn't. So she was trafficked by a Canadian intelligence
I believe,
officer,
yeah.
which is quite stunning, considering that, you know, there were, you know, people being killed at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's this practice of nationality stripping, you know, which is coming to the fore increasingly in the UK. So it's a very toxic relationship. One of the things the Labour government in the early 70s did was withdraw from east of Suez. In other words, there would be no British military presence or Suez, probably east of Cyprus. You know,
I was gonna say,
no, I think east of Suez was the term they used because Cyprus Suez, if necessary, would be in striking distance from Cyprus.
Yes.
So the term tends to be east of Suez, but it didn't involve.
And of course, the British Army withdrew from Palestine and went to Cyprus in 48.
So what happened was the Labour government of the day withdrew British military forces in the Gulf, and the Gulf states kind of had to sort of fend for themselves, but with obviously us selling them arms and intelligence and surveillance and all that kind of stuff.
And of course, there was the so-called butcher of Bahrain,
Ian Henderson. Yeah,
Ian Henderson, who was
butcher of Bahrain.
He, whenever workers striked or went on protests, he would what's the word? Invite them in and torture them.
Which continues to this day.
Right. And of course, Bahrain is an ally of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. So what happened? The Labour withdrew from Suez, but what happened, I think, with Cameron's government just after the 2011 uprising?
Yes.
They re-established a naval base in Bahrain.
Yeah.
It already had an American one. I think it's the headquarters of the US. I can't remember if it's 5th or 6th Fleet.
Yes. Was this after the invasion of the Saudis?
This was, in the immediate aftermath.
Because you were involved in that, not the invasion, but you were involved in the melee.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We can talk about that in a bit. Yeah. But if you look through your archives, you can see, you know, nice pictures of Prince Andrew of all people. Charming. Like inspecting soldiers and sailors walking up and down. And this is the reopening of HMS. I can't remember what it's called now. It's not a ship, but it's called HMS. I can't remember the name of it, but HMS Jufair. I think it's named after where it is. Reopening the naval base, which now gives Britain a sort of a pincer in the Middle East. So you've got significant military assets in Cyprus and significant military assets in Bahrain. So
Well, I suppose the Americans are the top dogs in that part in that sea, but I mean Britain now compared to what it was.
It's an odd thing because it's if you think of this whole issue around Britain's unilateral secession from the European Union, known as Brexit in baby language.
Yes.
You had this thing. You have this whole idea of global Britain. And it's trying to sort of like, you imagine you got a fire like you're camping out in the desert, and the embers have gone out, and you're like frantically blowing the embers to try. So places like Bahrain are the embers that they're sort of frantically blowing on to try to reignite this idea. I mean, you wouldn't call it the British Empire anymore. This idea of global Britain. I mean, it's completely delusory. Yeah, it's complete and utter delusion. But that influence, that mutuality. I mean, you look at golf ownership of football teams.
Right. Yes. I've never seen. I thought it was very, very odd to watch Newcastle fans celebrate a Saudi takeover. Yeah. It's very strange to see.
Saudi Arabia's sovereign fund, I think, though, people will pull you. It's not actually owned by Saudi Arabia. It's a sovereign wealth fund or overseas wealth fund or something. But
tautology.
But because in those parts of the world, it's hard to separate, private hyper wealth, with the wealth of states because
it's kinship.
They're kinship dictatorships.
Yeah.
El Nahyans and El Khalifas and anyway, the Sauds obviously and the Sabahs and whatever, I remember there was a time with the first Gulf War, someone had written a letter, I think it was to the Guardian, about complaining about nepotism and how this is why are we going to war to help this family state and all the rest of it. It's wrong what Iraq's done, but you have to be, a member of the ruling Al-Sabah family to, and this very angry letter of repudiation coming back. It's got whatever his name was, I don't know. Yours sincerely. It's nothing like that. What's he talking about? Yours sincerely, whatever it was. I don't know. Ahmed Al-Sabah, Prime Kuwaiti ambassador.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, so you have that whole thing. And so teaching literature, I then realised was you're treading on very thin ice. So I did a course on post-colonial literature. I was teaching, and I thought that's interesting. That's something to get your teeth into. This is a few years after the other incident when I started working in the UAE, and post-colonial literature. That's really good. This is in Bahrain. And I was looking through this anthology that we were using as a reader for the students. And I thought, well, I better not start with any post-colonial literature from anywhere around here or even in the Muslim world. Where can I start? I thought, I know, let's start close to home with Ireland. And
that's a very good move. That's a very, very good move.
And I thought, okay, yeah, that's fine. Because the students might not even think of it in terms of somewhere that was colonised.
Right.
So I started, using excerpts and short stories, poems and stuff, from Irish literature in the, during the 20th century. And students immediately started making connections, with institutionalised sectarianism in Northern Ireland and institutionalised sectarianism in Bahrain, and
of course,
asking questions that were getting increasingly difficult to answer without articulating an explicitly political opinion about what was going on in Bahrain, and I was trying to be as
Yes, of course. Sectarianism quite often is imposed from above as a absolutely.
Yeah. And I was thinking how how to, be as neutral as possible, but still honour what the literature was about. Right. And I thought I did a reasonably good job. I was going out to my car, and it was in the evening, and a couple of men in white turned up. You know, the men in white.
Yes.
You know, the ultra white.
Yes.
Almost blue white.
Yes.
Immaculately creased.
Yes.
Dish dashers and stuff like that. Mukhabarat there.
Mukhabarat is intelligence officers.
Yeah. And said, look, you're not from here. I understand what you're trying to do and everything else, but this student here asked you the question. She supports Khomeini. Khomeini was dead, but she supports Khomeini. This one's pro-Iranian. This one's pro-Syrian. This one's pro-Hezbollah. Can't you teach it differently? I was minded to say, well, have a look at the book and you choose somewhere.
Right.
Which kind of I was supposed to be teaching.
What did you tell them in the end?
I was just at that point. I was very sort of respectful. I said, I do my dumb foreigner act. I didn't know. I thought Ireland's a long way away. Didn't imagine it would possibly be relevant to Bahrain or any of the Gulf states. Why should I think that?
So you're supposed to teach a humanities course, but not talk about politics. I mean, how absurd,
or society, or
absurd can it get? I mean, never mind.
I mean, there were multiple absurdities. There was one generalist course we were doing where they had the Norton Anthology of English Literature. I think it was massive, great tome. In fact, it's in 2 volumes, and we were doing literature of the Enlightenment, so I'd go through various different texts with them, and I was looking through it one day, and because you have to be really, really careful what you can and cannot say. I mean, for example, you would teach, it's on the curriculum that you teach D.H. Lawrence, but you have to find one without any sex in it. Yeah.
I mean, that's even controversial in this country.
Yeah, I mean, you had to find something that doesn't have sex in it, which you can, but I mean, it's not, anyway, So I was looking, this is Enlightenment literature. I was thumbing through the text, I think, again, because I learned to read ahead.
You just reminded me of the time when I was in Damascus, and I was with a Canadian and I think 2 German women, and the Canadian wanted to go to Al-Bahsa, I think, which is the library or bookshop district of Damascus. So went to all of the shops, and 3/4 of the shop was Islamic jurisprudence, learning your own religion. And then the 1/4 was self-help books from Egyptian authors, and Syrian as well, with bad hair. And and then there was one book in English. It was very, very obscure, and it's from the 19th century, the least political book imaginable. And it was on a pedestal. It was like on a stand, on a clear plastic stand. This is the book you're allowed to read.
What was it?
It was very obscure.
This was so. I was, and I've to my horror come across this poem by the Earl of Rochford, who was a Restoration era rake, and basically. He was very promiscuous, and the first time he was genuinely in love with a woman, his dick wouldn't work. So the poem is like he couldn't get an erection. So the poem is like a curse to his dick, and it goes something like, throughout the worst part of me, and therefore hated most. Throughout the town, a well-known fucking post, on which whores do whatever, ease their tingling cunt and stuff, And I was thinking, oh my God, this is the actual book that the students have got. You know, it's the actual Norton Anthology of English
So
Literature.
the Bahraini students.
This was in the UAE.
Oh, right.
You know, it's a compendium. It's a multi-volume compendium of selected English literature from selected time. No, but they just go through it, you see.
Right.
You know, and I thought, oh my God. No, what do I do? Do I tell them not to look at this? And then you think about the university authorities, if they're so censorious about this stuff, then why don't they produce their own anthology?
It's like England in the 1950s or something, or worse. It's just, it is sad the way things are censored.
You know, and it was like, even with Arabic literature, there was an Ibn Arabi ode, qasida. And it starts off, it ends up very, very ecumenical, and it starts off, or near the beginning, it's like, لَقَدْ صَارَ قَلْبِي كَابِلُ كُلِّ سُورَةٍ, my heart has become accepting of all forms. And then he goes on about the Torah and the Kaaba and the gazelles in the field and the Bible and monks and monasteries and all that. It's very, very kind of ecumenical. Oh, that's a nice poem. You know, but it starts off like a lot of these medieval odes do. It starts off with a sort of erotic longing that's like a lover, abandoned lover looking up into a tree, and there's the cooing hamama, the dove, you know, and they're looking at each other. And I think the verb, if I remember rightly, was to wedge a hair. It's the reciprocal form of the verb, face to face.
Right.
You know.
Yes.
You know. And afterwards, this very pious woman with niqab comes up and said, "Sir." I said, "What?" I said, "That poem, you probably don't know about our culture." I said, "But she goes, it's a rude word. To wedge your hair, the verb.
To wedge your
hair.
It's not rude. It means to face.
Yeah, no, face to wedge your hair. It's the third form of the verb to do with reciprocality.
Right.
So it's face to face. It's two.
Yes.
You know, and I need to get the form of the verb right. It's the one that begins with a tar, then you have the first radical, and then you have the long aleph, and then you have the second radical. It's that form, you know. And she goes, I said, what does it mean? It means face to face. He goes, sir, and she looks around, he goes, it means fucking. You know, and I can think of like half a dozen.
Did she say that in English?
Yeah, because that's the other irony, that people don't necessarily see it as a rude word because they go and watch films.
Oh,
you know.
That's hilarious.
They just think it's a normal word. They don't think it's a rude word or a swear word. You know.
But she thought she was offended by tawajah because she thought
because the face-to-face element, the reciprocality of that form of the verb implied.
And so, what if it meant fucking?
Well, so what if it did anyway? I mean, it's supposed to be mildly erotic. You know, she's looking at the doe-eyed maiden is looking up into the tree and missing her lover, and here's this dove reminds her of something rather than the dove and her are looking at each other face to face as she wishes she was face to face with her lover.
Yes. All right. Yes.
So it's implicit, but I mean, for God's sake. You know, I mean, I don't realise that's what they do with Arabic literature. Never mind, you know, you have this kind of minefield.
But interestingly, with a lot of these countries, there is a very active subculture that's kind of very free but hidden sort of thing.
Well, this is a very important point because these things aren't hegemonic at all. I mean, sorry, these things aren't hegemonic at all. I mean, a lot of people pay lip service to sort of official ideologies and whatnot, just as a way of making life easier on a day-to-day basis. But beneath it all, there's a whole different world that's much more dynamic and much more creative. And
that's really a key point. Yeah. There's a book by Lisa Wedeen, Professor Lisa Wedeen, who talks about people acting as if. So in public, there's no such thing as public, but in public, should we say, people act as if they're loyal, act as if they say the right things, but they know to each other personally that what they really think. But as soon as they step out of line of acting as if, that's when the issues start in despotic regimes.
And indeed, you know, I think what the regimes, when they tried to develop higher education in the way they were doing, you know, particularly with, you know, mass female participation, which is very new.
Right.
You know, they didn't appreciate the extent to which there would be a creative symbiosis beneath that unofficial subculture,
Yes,
and the kind of subjects that they were studying at
bubbles
university.
up to the surface.
You know, that there would be this symbiosis that,
yeah,
you know, to put it more directly, would make that generation of people less inclined to take crap. You know,
right. And of course, there is a difference between this generation and the previous generation.
Very much so.
And the generation before that.
Yeah, very much so, absolutely, because you're looking at very rapid development, really, very rapid development, you know. And I think the authorities tended to, they wanted this, for want of a better expression, sort of liberalised approach to higher education, insofar as it would produce economic benefits, but thought that they could isolate that from political and social developments.
Yes.
You know,
I mean, you can't. Underlying this, there needs to be first and foremost an economic development, and then afterwards. But then, because of the way people are, and because we're incredibly complex individuals, etc., and free thinkers by nature, people do develop socially before the economic development. But the Marxist argument is that first you need to have, and here we go with Marx, economic development first, and then you'll have cultural development. Is that right?
Until you get to Gramsci, who then emphasises the importance of culture as a grounds of political contestation, but classical Marxism,
and Weber as well.
You know, and so this stuff was going on, and it's one of the factors that led to the student uprisings in Bahrain, which perhaps I'll talk about in a bit. But before, you know, I don't want to be thought of as one of these people who's, look at these people in the Arab world, look at the way they are, they're wacko, they're this, they're that, they're. You know, because we're no different.
Yeah.
You know, and if you have this thing of an official ideology that everyone pays lip service to, but nobody really believes in, look at the way Brexit's discussed in this country. The Conservative Party no longer is a Conservative Party, I think, in any meaningful sense. It was effectively being not so much infiltrated, but it's partly infiltrated and part pushed in the direction of the UKIP far right, so that they swallowed so much of their agenda. So no one can ever go back and Brexit, no matter how destructive it is. You know, it was never anything other than a good thing. You know, but then in order to be electable, Labour has to adopt exactly the same position.
Right, of course.
So you'll find Starmer say, no, Brexit is settled. Brexit is, we're not going to revisit that again. Brexit's happened. We just want to make Brexit better. You know, Liberal Democrats and the Greens are a bit different. You know, very different. But most of the media isn't. Most of the media is not this BBC. Most of the print media, with the exception of the Guardian and a couple of others, it's this whole thing that, well, Brexit's happened. Brexit was a good thing. All the negative effects that we are experiencing now are to do with something else. They're to do with the pandemic. They're to do with the war in Ukraine. And people know. I mean, people know that there are comparator countries in Europe that also experienced the pandemic at a similar level, that also have been affected by the war in Ukraine, but aren't doing as badly as the UK is. So I think that, you know, as an example, you know, the kind of omerta around Brexit, you know, is an example of how, look, you know, this isn't, this business of like an official ideology that can't be denied or shouldn't be denied. It doesn't only exist.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. First and foremost, you have to remember that in colonialism, which lasted at least 250 years, there were the beneficiaries and people who didn't, and the people who were colonized. And this has an effect, a massive effect on the political economy of the region. So, for example, in Egypt, there was the cotton industry, where Egypt became the supplier of cotton to the Lancashire cotton mills, and in the West, in Britain and elsewhere in the West, there was a class struggle that developed as a result of having the proletariat and bourgeoisie have it out, as it were. Whereas in Egypt, there was no working class. There was only a lumpen proletariat. And there was no bourgeoisie because they were absent. They were absent. So if you do have a class struggle, you can't have one because they're not there. There are only the state administrators who were very brutal and violent in order to extract the cotton. And so what happens over the course of 250 years is that the shape in which the configuration of society is different in the economic peripheries than in the centre. And so that's why you have despotic regimes in the Middle East and elsewhere in other parts of the world.
To modify that, I think, with regard to the Gulf states, one of the issues with that part of the world, with the exception of Bahrain and with the exception, I think, of Oman, is that what they tend to do is to import the working class.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
So you have the whole controversy around
lumpen proletariat.
The uneducated. No, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but you know what I mean. Your physical manual workers. All the controversies around the Qatar stadium. And with no political rights whatsoever. Confiscate their passports. Can send them, deport them at a moment's notice. If they die on the job through heat exposure or something, well, I don't know, bung a couple of $1,000 to their relatives back in Nepal or somewhere. All those controversies around the Qatar World Cup stadia. But, I mean, Bahrain, for example, has that to a bit, but it has its own indigenous working class.
Right.
And this is where the sectarian glass ceiling comes into it, that it isn't all like kind of, indentured workers from far away. It's indigenous people, many of whom can trace their ancestry on the island way beyond when the ruling dynasty took over.
Oh, I see.
A lot longer. People who call themselves the Bahrana, the indigenous Bahrainis, who, whether it's true or not, like to trace their ancestry back to the builders of all the Bronze Age burial mounds. Bahrain, I think, has got the world's largest concentration of Bronze Age burial mounds.
Yes.
It's very likely to be the Dilmun that's mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Oh yes, the world's first song. Yes.
First work of literature, probably.
Yes.
Cuneiform writing was originally there to keep records. It's probably why writing was invented.
So they go right back to that.
Yeah. I mean, whether those. I mean, you have to be careful of sort of nationalistic truth claims.
Yes, of course.
But I mean, it's quite plausible that anyway, relative to that, the ruling.
Someone had to go back all the way back.
Yeah, someone had to have lived there. And more recently, the Shi'i Bahrainis tend to. I mean, you have people with relatives in Iran. Mainly, it tends to be people who got sort of tribal affiliations, not with Iran, but with Al-Qatif, which is the area just the other side of the causeway that now connects Bahrain with Saudi Arabia, which also happens to be a majority Shiite area, and it also happens to be where most of the oil is, and also with the Shiite communities in the south of Iraq. So you have that multi-layered thing. You have that
which is why it became so sensitive, the whole issue during the so-called Arab Spring.
Yeah. Because Bahrain is the I think it's fair to say it's the only Gulf state that had a significant nationalist movement.
Right.
You know, and the reason it had a significant nationalist Arab nationalist movement is because it had its own indigenous working class.
Oh, right. So they were listening, huddled up and listening to the radio.
Yeah.
Because whenever Nasser used to speak, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the whole world used to listen to the radios. He was a big figure at the time.
But you know, if you've got these sort of family states and it's all to do with hydrocarbon extraction, a very neo-colonial thing, and your working class is imported from somewhere else and you can just get rid of them and get some more anytime you like, then that's not going to be the kind of environment that's conducive to
organisation.
The organisation of anti-colonial movements at all. Whereas Bahrain is slightly different because it has its own indigenous working class.
Right. Okay.
You know, who would be in a position, I don't know, you know, pretty much like a working class Iraqi or Syrian would be.
Right.
Vis-a-vis the ruling regime.
Yeah.
You know.
But the point is that instead of the bourgeoisie, people who own the means to production, you have the state class who captured the state and who administer and bureaucratically and violently the extraction of wealth or the drain of wealth.
Yeah, in a client relationship, it's a economy in a client relationship with hegemonic transatlantic powers. The family state, you can think of them as a different terminology. You can call it a monarchical dictatorship.
Yes.
So it's a dictatorship that's dressed up like a monarchy.
Yeah.
You know, a family state, I think, is a pretty accurate term. Well, obviously, below that, they've got a layer of clients who benefit from the system. It's not simply the ruling family.
Neo-patrimonialism it's called.
That's it. Neo-patrimonialism. Yeah, okay. Yeah. You know, so Bahrain was a bit different. And it does have that tradition of anti-colonial radicalism that goes back to, or before Nasser, it goes back to, I think, at least the 1930s.
Right.
You know, and which the British were very concerned to repress for obvious reasons. And hence you have that whole security cooperation.
Yeah.
You know, you still have it. I think the guy who took he's dead now, Ian Henderson, but the guy who took on a similar role to, it was to reform the Bahrain police force, was a guy called John Yates, who I don't think he was commissioner, or he might have been assistant commissioner. He was very, very high up in the Metropolitan Police. And he got his fingers burnt with the phone hacking scandal.
Oh, right.
And then went over to become an advisor for the reform of the Bahraini security system. So
you were there in 2011.
Yeah.
You were there in 2011.
2007 to 11, yeah.
Yeah. And it didn't end well.
No, it didn't end well for everybody. I mean, it's interesting, as I say, Bahrain has had that tradition of militancy. It's had a tradition of trade union militancy and, you know, people, you know, resistance movements in the street fighting, you know, going back some time. But the tactics were slightly different. The tactics in 2011 were in many ways inspired by movements you had found elsewhere in the world, like the Occupy movements.
Yes,
you know,
yes.
The idea that
Militant particularism, as I think David Harvey called it.
It was to do with the idea that you occupy prestige,
yes,
public space.
Yeah.
Maidan Tahrir in Cairo.
Yes.
The Lu'lu, the Pearl Square roundabout.
Oh right,
in Bahrain.
Lu'lu means pearl. Yeah.
And Lu'lu roundabout. It was this 7 arms. It's called a roundabout, but roundabout doesn't do it justice.
It was from pictures. Yeah.
Absolutely huge. And before all this happened, you'd turn up at the roundabout. It's like a Grand Prix track. And at some point, you got to pull out. So you would, pray to whatever divinity you have faith in, and shut your eyes and pull out. So this huge. It got 7 arms.
Yes.
I think each representing one of the Gulf states.
Oh,
with a huge pearl on the top.
Yes.
Yeah, Bahrain was pre-hydrocarbons, is known for its pearl industry.
Oh, right.
And so it was what was it, Maidan Lu'lu, and so we had prestige social space. So you have mass occupations, people of all generations. You had this incredible, almost like kind of anarchist, like self-organization, just comes out of nowhere,
like student movement.
Yeah, I mean you would have stages, you'd have media platforms, you would have people with huge cauldrons making, great big vats of rice and food, people going around with trays of tea and coffee. Yeah. It's that whole autonomous.
Because I was there with London Occupy, and that got really interesting. I really loved the atmosphere there. It started, I think, in New York, didn't it? New York Stock Exchange. It might have been.
Was it? Portland, Oregon. I can't. It was one of the big.
Right.
Oh, what was the conference?
The big one was in New York Stock Exchange, and that's where the 1% comes from. The phrase.
Yeah. And 1%. Going back beyond that, in the early 1980s, you had Stop the City.
Oh right.
Where you had a sort of mainly anarchists and anarchist punks had a day of action in the city, the square mile, city of London. So you occupy it.
Yeah.
The traffic can't move about.
Yeah.
There's like sort of street theatre and bands playing. And
where does this Occupy movement come from? Is it inspired by Henri Lefebvre, the man who wrote about city spaces?
There's elements of perhaps Gandhiism in it, of sort of non-violent resistance.
Yes.
Because if the worst people are doing is stopping the traffic.
Yes.
Why it's harder to shoot them than stop you shooting them, because that's what ended up happening.
Yes. I suppose that's what's happening now with Extinction Rebellion. And what's the other one? There's another one.
There's a situation where you can end up with a longer jail sentence for pulling down the statue of a slave trader than you would for rape, which is
that what happened? Surely not.
Legislation that went through after they pulled down
afterwards.
in Bristol.
Yes.
They pulled
but that's
down
the new legislation.
If this is UK, if a demonstration is deemed, very vague words, I think, like annoying or a nuisance.
Yes, very deliberately vague.
And the police, which is straight out the dictatorship playbook.
Yeah.
The Arab world had it, the former Eastern Bloc would have had it. It's causing a nuisance, it's antisocial.
Yes. Well, let's remember that there was a real struggle for human rights in this country, in the UK, that lasted decades and decades.
Well, it's only just over the length of a human life that women had the vote.
Yeah.
And, it's only a generation or two before that you could vote if you didn't own property.
Yeah.
There's a lot of mythology around.
So there's a whole dynamic that keeps going in terms of people power versus the state.
It's this whole
economic and it's linked to economic development.
And so the occupation of prestige space, and it had that amazing, almost like kind of anarchist. As far as I'm aware, I don't think maybe some of the students, because the students played a very big role in it. because the older generation, they were involved in other kinds of activism, like straightforward. You're not allowed to have political parties, but you can have political societies out there.
Right. Infiltrated by mukhabarat.
Which they all would obviously be, and rigged elections, everyone knows what the results are.
I'm sure I was followed when I was in Damascus. I mean, it's a standard thing. It wasn't even very... I think there was one time when I went into my room and it was locked, that someone had eaten my pain au chocolat with the laptop open. So it's a standard thing, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, a surveillance state. It's crude, of course, because now a lot of that surveillance.
And they're not subtle.
No, it's very, very crude. It's
very overt.
Like the Men in White when I had a word with them after my literature class.
Yes.
Very unsubtle.
Yeah.
So the idea is that you had people in political societies, you had people who were in trade union movements, you had people who would have been involved in sort of street confrontations and stuff. So the Occupy thing was very new. And so they were looking...
And yes, so how did you get involved in this, if at all?
Well, okay, it's really interesting because Lu'lu'a was huge.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
like
small...
Trafalgar Square.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge in terms of population.
Right.
I mean, a population of a couple of million, you're getting hundreds of thousands.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you had, a protest in Britain with 5 million people in it. I mean, it's absolutely huge. You couldn't miss it.
Yeah.
And so it's something you go and see. And I mean, it reminded me very much of stuff I've read about, anarchism and libertarian socialism. But there are other occupations as well. There are attempts to occupy the financial district, the diplomatic district, because that like Al-Muhandiseen, you've got the compartmentalised city.
Engineers district.
And one of the pieces of prestige public space to be occupied was obviously the university campus, Al-Sakhir, in the south of the island, right by where the Bahrain International Circuit is, the Formula One circuit.
Oh, right, yeah.
Right, literally next door to it. In fact, you'd have... university would have holidays when they're practicing because the noise from the cars was ear splitting. It's like literally next door to it.
So what did the protesters want, from what you understood?
Interesting question. Isqat al-Nizam.
The fall of the regime.
Yeah.
Why did they want that, do you think?
Because it was seen as brutal and unjust and corrupt and not representative of the people and a neo-colonial construct. Now I'm being slightly facetious when I say fall of the regime, but because there are different tendencies, so you would get different types. You would have like straightforward liberals. You would have trade unionists, you would have socialists, you would have Arab nationalists, you would have Islamists, but they tended to be Shi'i Islamists,
right?
If you see what I mean.
So there was a kind of temporary alliance within the movement that would fragment after the
and that's not uncommon in sort of like revolutionary situations. That you have this alliance, and some of the alliances might be long lasting, and some of their alliances of convenience, and also just to have just a lot of people who were just simply pissed off. A lot of people who felt marginalised, a lot of people who were angry because they couldn't get certain kinds of jobs, no matter what their qualifications were.
So local grievances were transferred onto, imagined upon, onto national. So local grievance became a national grievance.
In fact, I'd say it was largely led by that, rather than ideologies. I mean, you would have people who represented certain ideological positions, and some were more successful in their outreach than others, but the grassroots of it was popular dissatisfaction and grievance.
So did you visit the Pearl Square?
Yeah, several times, because you couldn't not notice it.
Right.
Because it was just so huge.
Yeah.
And it wasn't called a general strike, but de facto it's like a general strike. Nobody's at work, all that kind of thing. The university wasn't operating because there weren't any students. And so, you would go and see, and it took quite some getting to because all the roads congested and, like you imagine you're going to like a huge festival or something, and then you'd find somewhere safe-ish to park and walk around. It was.
In the meantime, the rulers who were like feeling, worried, and
it was getting close to the regime starting to topple.
Oh, right.
Because the country just simply wasn't working properly. It's like that kind of like.
And you can imagine the local ruler getting very nervous.
So they had a go at clearing the square with armed force. I wasn't there when it happened. It happened one night, I think, after the night after I'd been there, early during the day, and they went in, riot police, with various kinds of weaponry, including riot guns, which would fire either baton rounds or CS gas or birdshot that they used very liberally.
What's birdshot?
Birdshot is like sort of like you'd have in a shotgun for shooting birds.
Really?
So if you shoot someone from a distance,
yeah,
it's unlikely to kill them, but you'll be peppered with like little bits of shot.
Sounds very serious.
No. And it was, and they would also use CS gas. They'd combine the function of a baton round with the gas canister. So rather than firing it in front of the demonstrators or whatever to make them disperse, they would shoot directly at them. So the gas canister would be effectively like a rubber bullet, or it wasn't rubber, it was metal.
Yeah.
So there were a number of people killed like that, would be hit by the impact of the gas canister if it hit you on the head, or if it hit you over the heart.
Yes.
It might not break the skin, but the shock would stop your heart.
Yeah.
And then the gas would come out. So it was a sort of,
But you found yourself within a gas cloud.
On multiple occasions. This was a totally. I'll tell you another anecdote about that in a moment. Just to the Pearl.
Yeah.
Pearl. It was cleared during the night, and there was a lot of gunfire. A lot of people were killed. One oldish man, I think in his early 60s. They put the riot gun right up against his head with birdshot and blew his brains out. And there was very graphic imagery of that circulating. So this was the Bahrain riot police with some background support of the military. They cleared the roundabout. What happened?
So it was brute force and ignorance.
Absolutely. And what happened a couple of days later is we're not having that. There was mass convergence on the roundabout, and it was reoccupied. In fact, if anything, it was reoccupied on an even bigger scale than before.
By the security forces?
By the protesters.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. And the security forces tried to stop them from doing that.
Yeah. And the accusation from the state was that this was an Iranian-backed demonstration.
All that sort of thing. Yeah. I mean, the one for international consumption, if you like, was that this is an opportunistic Iranian attempt to subvert the country off the back of what was also at that time happening in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere.
And was there any evidence for that?
Well, I mean, there would, of course, in Bahrain, there would be Iranian agents, and of course there would. Obviously, there would be. I think the role they played in that was really quite minor. Yeah. but that was a thing. It was part of this for the consumption.
So it was a push towards democratization.
Very much so, very much so. And it was getting, the regime was starting to totter, and the Gulf states collectively, the GCC, and the West was becoming very aware of a domino effect in the region, because the Arab Spring, if you like, is all very well from a Western point of view if it involves the fall of regimes that historically have been a thorn in their side, Syria or Libya particularly.
Double standards.
That's fine. That's fine. Let's encourage that. Let's support people who are opposing the government, even if they're Al Qaeda types. Doesn't matter. The idea that could happen, in a Gulf state, and with the potential to spread through the region, was something that wouldn't be allowed to stand.
Right.
So what happened was...
Which is why the Saudis invaded.
Yeah. Right. What happened was there's the King Fahd causeway that connects Bahrain to the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. It's a really long causeway, about 17 kilometres, but it actually zigzags across some very small islands, so it isn't one long causeway.
Right.
And the Saudi military invaded across the causeway one day, and with token support from some other Gulf states. I think there were a few, Emirati police units, and basically it was the Saudi military. Yeah. And the media, state-run television was just full of heroic music and these armoured vehicles with Saudi turret of a tank, with a man got a heavy machine gun on top of things, sort of doing like victory things, and there's this running commentary with it scrolling across in Arabic. This is the fraternal intervention of our fraternal intervention of our Saudi brethren and all the rest of it.
You just reminded me of this video of, I think it's the Egyptian Police Academy graduation ceremony, and they all look, just incredibly macho, like what's the word? A hulking brute. With a man like topless, and they were going through with the cars, and it was just incredibly absurd.
Very much like
absurd.
That. And this convoy just went on and on and on, for, I can't remember exactly how long it took to pass, but it come over the causeway. I didn't live too far from the Bahrain end of the causeway. And of course, one of the very first things they did was to completely crush, again very murderously, so they were used. Oh yeah, definitely, very murderously to crush the reoccupied roundabout, and then set up roadblocks all over the place. There were people shot and killed. There was a lot of trigger happy, probably in their late teens, Saudi soldiers. To be clear, we're talking about Western allies. Yeah, absolutely. Armed by, all those vehicles. They weren't made in Saudi Arabia. No, really. They would have been American or British. Bradley fighting vehicles and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So the first thing they did was that, and then demolished the actual Pearl Monument, which ironically was originally built as a sign of GCC unity, and demolish the whole roundabout, and surround it with razor wire and armed guards. Lots of roadblocks. There were people who shot dead at roadblocks. Lots of trigger-happy Saudi soldiers who from probably quite remote parts of Saudi Arabia to what was happening, who had been told a load of bullshit about what's happening. Yeah. They're here to protect the Arab world against the Persians and all this. Just told complete nonsense. They don't have a clue what was going on.
Brute force and ignorance.
Brute force and ignorance, and so then any kind of public protest become really just impossible. You know, it was a death sentence if you even attempted that.
Yes.
So what happened is that the resistance went back into the villages, you know, because you have these like small villages where a lot of the indigenous Shiite population live,
Right.
very close communities, lots of quite narrow alleyways, and that where it's feasible to block off the road and erect barricades, rain Molotovs down on top of.
So it became a fully fledged police state akin to North Korea.
Yeah, with martial law imposed, draconian sentences. There was one student I taught, literature student, got 15 years for writing and performing at the roundabout an anti-regime poem. 15 years. There was a big international outcry about that, led by organisations like PEN and Amnesty International and whatever, and eventually her sentences commuted. But yeah, you know, lots of all that sort of stuff was going on. Marauding bands of vigilantes, Bultajia types, you know, in pickup trucks. So it's a very unsafe place to be. And
state hired thugs.
Yeah, all sorts of people, violent criminals let out of prison early for the purpose.
Yeah.
The first time I ever saw what later became known as the ISIS flag, you know, the black one with the Shahada in like Kufi writing.
Because I hadn't seen anything like that until relatively recently. It's a recent phenomenon, isn't it?
So you'd have like jihadists, basically anybody, as long as they were against for their own reasons, what was happening. And it became a very dangerous place to be.
Yeah. And at some point you were victim of gassing.
The first time that happened was before any of this had happened.
Right.
Because they'd use gas very liberally, and my daughter was born in Jidhaf's maternity hospital, which is in the middle of quite a shitty district. In December of 2008, so I hadn't been there that long, and there was a gathering. I think it was around the time of one of the commemorations of the Shi'i martyrs. It wasn't Ashura. I think it was a different one to that. But these things had a habit of developing into protests,
right?
You know,
being Shias, and
and there were lots of young men around, and all sort of, you know, furthered up with the, you know, and a lot of this was taking place right round where the maternity hospital was. Right. So my daughter was a couple of days old, and the riot police turned up to disperse.
Just randomly.
They were fighting with these lads, these shabab, if you like, youth.
You know, lads.
Using, you know, I mean, one side would have their riot guns and gas, and the other side would have like half bricks or sharpened concrete reinforcing rods used as spears, that kind of thing, you know. And so they fight. And
so these are pilgrims from Iran, are they?
No. This is entirely the local people.
Shias,
Yeah, local people. Just local people during the commemoration.
During one of the... during Eid or...
No, during one of... Because the famous one is Ashura, which is for Al-Hussein. But they also have commemorations for the other 12 imams.
Because I used to, when I was in Damascus, I was near Sitra Khayyam shrine, and you had Irani pilgrims come in with their coach load at 4 a.m. It was absolutely fascinating to see. Really incredible.
But anyway, I can imagine. Yeah, no, these weren't from Iran. These were local people.
Oh, right. Yeah, okay.
And inevitably some tear gas canisters came into the hospital grounds. At that point, my partner had asked me to go and get some stuff from the car. So I didn't realise what was... I was aware there was a crowd outside and police might be called, but I wasn't quite sure what was going on. So I went to fetch something from the car, and something's not right here. And there's like this like chemically taste in my mouth. My eyes started. Oh my God, it's gas! And then all of a sudden it hits you really quickly.
Yeah, it does,
it hits
doesn't it?
It starts off like something doesn't smell right. Your eyes itch, and then the next thing you know, your throat's all constricting. And
people don't realise how intense
yeah.
of an experience it is.
Yeah. You can't do anything. You know. Some of the local people had various techniques. They'd have like goggles and they'd have masks. I can't remember. I can't remember what it was, but there's some chemical preparations. If you soak gauze in, or you can put a keffiyeh around here, or you can have like an industrial mask.
Right.
I can't remember.
So
what
you find yourself in the middle of
this was in the hospital.
Inside the hospital.
Gone in the hospital.
Oh my God.
Hospital's got walled compound.
Yeah.
And the gas had gone inside the hospital grounds, not the actual hospital itself, the grounds.
Right.
And I thought, oh my God! Immediately I realised what it was, and I just sort of struggled to get back in the hospital, and I was trying to sort of, just wait till I can like open my eyes properly and breathe properly and whatnot. And I thought, oh, my daughter, and so I was this nurse, and so your daughter's in an incubator. Because she was slightly premature.
Was she affected?
No, she wasn't, because this was outside. But I thought when she said, "Oh, your daughter's in the incubator," I thought, oh my God, that's exactly what's happened. And so the nurse goes, "Oh no, it's just a precaution." I can't even remember what language he was speaking. She goes, "Oh no, it's just a precaution." He goes, "We always do this when gas comes in the hospital."
So they're used to it.
Yeah, we always the newborn baby, we put them straight in an incubator.
Oh, that's so sweet. Well, that's a homage to nurse
definitely
profession. Amazing, and so. You were a witness to all these terrible things, and so what happened next?
Well, just as an aside before we go there, there's often this idea, people who aren't in the region, that there was a copycat element to the Arab uprisings. That one country does it. Was it Tunisia was first? And then and it's all sort of copycatted in a kind of mindless way. But it's not all of these are long-standing grievances.
Yes,
in every country involved, and it was just more a case of okay. Well, if Tunisia can do it, Egypt can do it. If Egypt can do it, it's kind of like that. But all these grievances, of course, had long histories. As long as the
with roots in
colonialism thing. So if I go back a few days from the Saudi invasion to the university, at that time, I was a member of the college council. I was academic head of professional development of the newly founded Bahrain Teachers College, quite a senior position. And so I didn't really work in humanities at that point. However, and BTC was founded as a professional college to train teachers in a sort of non-academic, sort of professional practice way. Quite innovative in that part of the world. And a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, who from the Faculty of Arts, went to Egypt because obviously the things were happening in Egypt.
Yes.
She made the excuse that it was some family issue, but it was because of what was happening in Egypt.
Right.
And when she was in Egypt, she conveniently broke her leg.
Oh, to avoid going back?
Yeah.
How did that happen? Did she kind of get a rock and break her leg?
Slam her leg in a door or something?
Really?
I don't know. So I was covering for her. And I thought, I haven't taught literature for a couple of years now. It would be interesting to revisit that. And the class started quite early in the morning. I think it's 8:00 start class. And we were doing, what was I doing? I was doing Oedipus. And we were on the first page of Oedipus and Sophocles, and in English, obviously. And I think in the first or second page, there's a setting the scenario, and the city of Thebes. It's set in Thebes. Thebes is wailing through the blood and oppression and just purely by chance. This is what the text was. And then I suddenly noticed that the students weren't really paying attention. They're not fiddling with their phones, and then some of them were getting up and like looking out the window, and then a couple of them made excuses and went out the classroom, and then virtually the whole classroom just suddenly got up in one mass and just left. I think I was left with a couple of students.
Oh, really?
And they said, "Oh, what should we do?" I said, "I don't know. I mean, I wasn't quite sure what was happening myself."
Right.
I sort of looked out the window. It's a big campus university. I looked out the window and I could kind of see what was starting to happen. I thought, okay. I said, "Look, don't worry about the class." And so I sort of wrapped everything up, waited for the students to disperse, went downstairs where the refectory area was for this particular building, because they've got little island like buildings, and the whole, oh my God, I mean, there's hundreds of students, and there's students giving like impromptu speeches. I thought, this is massive. So I went outside, and you realise the whole campus is like that. And this was the beginning of the occupation of the campus.
Yes. How did it first start? I mean, what was the spark? I know that there was that started in other countries, but was there a spark that started it all?
I think there wasn't a particular incident at the university. I think there was an agreed date or a code word by people's phones or something like that.
Oh, I see.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's the subculture again communicating with itself.
Yeah, it's all that whole kind of autonomous organisation thing.
Yeah.
Okay, at a certain time, at a certain place, we're going to do this.
Yeah.
And then that all kicked off, and the campus was occupied, and what started to happen was not initially the police. Initially, it was your sort of Bultajia vigilante types started turning up and fighting with the students.
Yeah, the violent thugs.
Yeah. And because of the whole thing of female honour around there, the main square of the university, there was a lot of the female students in one mass, and they were surrounded by young men in a circle like a human chain,
right?
And they had broken up like bits of furniture and things to use as staves to fight these people off.
Wow.
And once that had started, that then give the security forces an excuse to come in. They'd say, "Oh, it's a sectarian fight between the Shia and to intervene." And then it started off with the riot police, and they were followed up by the military, who turned up in armoured personnel carriers and
is this the Saudi
helicopters.
or the
this is
Bahrain?
before. This is a few days before. This would have been Bahrain.
Right.
And helicopters hovering at low altitude, so that the rotors would throw up sand, which would help disorientate people.
Yes.
And there was sort of live fire from the helicopters.
Yeah.
It wasn't aimed. I don't think it was aimed fire. It was just simply there to just freak people out and make people disperse.
Right.
Around about that time, because of what I was saying about the indigenous working class, around about that time, the older male relatives of the students, who would have been, I don't know, fishermen, construction workers, those kinds of people, started turning up in pickup trucks with the tools of their trade as improvised weapons.
Wow.
I
had no idea it was so. I knew that
axes,
there was violence,
bars.
but I had no idea it was so violent. Incredibly violent. I mean, I'm thinking of 68 in Paris. I mean, you think of the cobblestones being thrown. That's nothing compared to what happened in Bahrain.
No, absolutely not. And the death toll, sounds quite low, as a couple of hundred, but you have to bear in mind that's out of a country with a very small population, in a very short space of time.
Yeah.
So divided as a percentage of the population, it was bigger to Bahrain than the deaths in the Troubles in Northern Ireland would have been to the UK.
Yeah.
Easily bigger as a percentage of people killed or injured or traumatised.
Right.
So this ongoing battle, and obviously because they're better equipped, the military and the riot police got the better hand. and I was like hiding and running and hiding and desperate to get off the campus. I had to wait for it to calm down a lot before I could even attempt to do that. There were wrecked vehicles and stuff. I went to where I parked my car, and luckily it was in one piece. I was very furtively looking around, and places littered with, you know, a lot of women's shoes and handbags and stuff like that, where young women had run en masse and left their things behind.
Yeah.
Little knots of fighting here and there, and it's a little bit of a drive to get off the campus because it's a purpose-built campus university.
All right.
So I'm going past, you know, knots of wrecked vehicles, burnt-out vehicles, all this sort of thing, soldiers, and I thought,
War zone.
yeah, or yeah, like a kind of.
Surely it's a crime to use the military against civilians.
Well, it is, yeah.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, and I thought it was going to be difficult. How do I negotiate this? There was one almost comic bit actually. Before you get to where the main gates of the university are, there's like a long drive with sort of palm trees on either side that sort of come together at the top and provide shade. And there's a roundabout there. And I was trying to get off the campus and no one knew. And there were these two Salafi guys. I say Salafi guys because they had the long unkempt beards, and they wear their thobes kind of quite high on the shin, and you can see the look.
Yeah.
And I was
going to say tobe in English. Garment, I guess, or
robe, I suppose.
Robe, yeah.
And they, you know, they've got a very distinctive look because they were,
yes,
you know, anyone who was pro-regime for any reason was invited to come along for the violence.
Right.
And these two guys are running as they're going around the roundabout, and one of them had a kind of stave, and another one had a spear, like a broom handle, I think it was, with a knife, sort of attached with like Jubilee clips to the end of it. Yeah, and just for a moment, I was going round the roundabout like this. And these guys are running behind me. I'm looking at them in my rear view mirror, and it was for a moment. It was almost comedic, you know. And they sort of, well, stop! I'm not going to stop for some maniac waving a spear.
Yeah.
You know. So I thought, what can I do? So I got to where the police and military had sealed off the entrance to it. Yes. And I thought, well, the best thing I can do is just play the dumb foreigner thing. So, you know, I only spoke to them in English. I said, what's going on? Please get me out, and all this. And you go, they were very, very bad people. We had to come here to stop bad people doing bad things. I said, no, I'm just going to... And I sort of bluffed my way out of that one. Yeah. And all you go up the highway,
But how, that's not bluffing, that's just reality, I guess. I suppose you didn't let on that you speak Arabic.
Yeah, I was hamming it up, you know, and
hamming it up,
you know, and it was, you know, in a way that would make it obvious. I was, you know,
right.
You know.
Sometimes I do that when I'm speaking French. I kind of speak in an English accent so that people understand that yes, I do speak French, but not to the
native speaker.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
know, and so I was driving back. And I had there's like knots of fighting dotted around the highway. And, you know, I just had this feeling it wasn't doom exactly, but this feeling that, oh my God, my life has changed irrevocably after this. I don't know how it's going to pan out, but nothing will ever be the same again.
Yeah.
You know. A few days after that was the Saudi invasion.
Right.
And along with the Saudi invasion is very much this sort of 21st century, well, it wouldn't be a coup, counter-revolution, I suppose. The whole internet goes down. The ATM stopped working.
Yes.
There's practically no public transport, but all the petrol stations are under armed guard, and only certain people can top their cars up.
Right.
You know, there were
so
military...
shut down everything.
Yeah, you can't do anything.
Unless you're part of the state class. Interesting.
You know, phones are only on intermittently. And when they are, you can hear these like weird delays and that it's probably being listened to.
Right. Yes.
And we just wanted to get off the island as quickly as we could.
Yeah. How did it affect you?
Well, at the time, it's that thing of like you're running on empty with adrenaline and whatever. For the safety of my family, I just wanted to get off the island as quickly as I could. And luckily, I was sort of reasonable friends with a guy who was British ambassador at the time, who was quite knowledgeable. He was a sort of public school, Oxbridge educated Arabist of the old school, okay, who had some kind of insight into the dynamics of what was going on. He was later replaced by another ambassador who had absolutely no in-country knowledge or specialist knowledge whatsoever. It was basically an arms salesman, and he would have let the last thing you want is someone who knows what's going on.
Maybe he would have a different view.
Yeah, I mean, he would have been quite happy if they'd have, threw me in jail. Yeah.
Really?
And so, this other one who replaced. But then he was the ambassador who he helped, got me a diplomatic pass and escort to get to the airport. And there's lots of people.
I'm sure he would have his own view on the situation.
He ended up doing a stint as ambassador to Oman, and then he's probably retired now, he did a stint as Prince Charles's, personal secretary or assistant personal secretary, or something like that. And so he was really, really good at getting us off.
Excellent.
And when
he did his job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good.
And the guy had to, he had got his fingers burnt because, he was doing his job as an ambassador. He met with a few days before this happened. He met with some leading figures in some of the opposition movements, just to get a sense from as Britain's ambassador what's going here from your perspective.
Right.
And he got majorly in the shit for that with the regime, who were kind of angling to get a different ambassador in.
Yeah.
And at one point there was an incident. It may even have been a manufactured incident, but someone tossed a Molotov over into the compound of the British embassy.
Right.
Apparently, an ordinary citizen of Bahrain outraged at the neo-colonial attitude of the ambassador, who's deigned to get in touch with people who claim to be members of the opposition. Whereas we all know everybody's loyal and there is no opposition.
Oh, right. Okay, I see. Yeah. Sure.
I mean, his diplomatic sin was acknowledging that an opposition existed.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
Yes. Rather than Iranian agents or criminal elements or all the usual things that come up with.
That despotic regimes come up with.
Yeah. I mean, if it was a communist one, it would be reactionary elements, counter-revolutionaries. This is Iranian agents, criminal elements, criminal gangs. Yeah, terrorists. That's a good catch. Terrorists.
So on and so forth.
So that was his diplomatic, and he's kind of on his way out.
So there's no opposition at all.
Yeah. So his diplomatic sin was acknowledging that there was an opposition.
So eventually you got back to the UK. What happened then?
Well, it's just such a weird thing to have happen to you.
Yeah.
First of all. And I come back, really experiencing something very close to what I'd imagine a refugee would experience.
Yeah.
With the crucial difference, I'm a British citizen, I've got a British passport, which makes a huge difference, obviously.
Yeah.
But apart from that, you leave behind a job, you leave behind a career, you leave behind a social network. You go through traumatizing experiences, you have to flee with your family to an uncertain future. In those regards, it was a very similar experience to that of being a refugee. And I was surprised how resilient I was. I managed to get a job, even though it was an adjunct, hourly paid job at a university within a week or two of just more or less turning up off spec. And I thought, oh, okay, I can, begin to settle down, get your head around it and everything else. And then it was like a delays effect of, I think about 6 to 9 months. The mental health aspects of it really hit me, really bad, and I started to get really horrible, traumatic PTSD flashbacks, nightmares, waking dreams, things that reminded me of what happened would send me into a complete panic attack so that I couldn't work. So triggers would be Brighton and Hove Albion, so football crowds. Because if you have that kind of urban confrontation, one of the ways the protesters compensate for the fact they don't have military equipment is that they have numbers. So you have a lot of roaring and all that kind of, and surging forward and all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that would crowds, roaring crowds, obviously fireworks, because you'd have this sort of doof, 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 which is the deep sound, which is very similar to the riot guns, and then you have that staccato crack, 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 like firecracker sounds, very similar to automatic fire. Unexpected helicopters, that was another one. Helicopters.
Yes.
Just the sound of helicopters. And unexpected things, like, for example, bald markers.
Bald markers?
Bald markers, white bald markers.
Oh, right, okay.
What I got this because when I was doing Oedipus, I had a red whiteboard marker, and I'd taken the cap off, and I was just about to write on the board when all this kicked off. And I realised I had this, one of the triggers for my PTSD was board markers. And I largely got over that through sort of various desensitization. But then what happened is that the dreams and nightmares and things become, rather than and the triggers indeed, rather than like set in Bahrain, like it was actually there, become more kind of symbolic.
Symbolic.
In the sense that, a dream or a nightmare or a waking dream or a waking trigger wouldn't be obviously, I had a nightmare and I was in Bahrain and this was happening. Literally reliving things that happened. Yeah. It would be something symbolic. It would be a horrific dream, but if you then thought about it, that's clearly what your mind's processing.
Oh, right, I see. Yeah.
And then I sank into very deep depression. And at one point I was on quite strong medications, and at one point I was suicidal, and I was self-medicating quite heavily, mainly on alcohol. Because alcohol does have that effect. It's more or less instant. There's a law of diminishing returns, but it's more or less instant. And I was in a terrible, terrible, terrible state.
I'm sorry.
Totally unable to work or function. Even I started speaking in characters.
Speaking in characters.
Yeah, like I had about 5 different people. Living in my head with different voices.
When the mind fragments into different,
with different voices. So people say, "What are you talking about?" I said, "I'm not talking about anything."
Yeah, it's the ultimate in dissociation, isn't it? Yeah, that's sounds really tough, and I'm sorry that you've been going through that.
Well, I'm largely over it now. I mean, it had a massive negative impact on my career, obviously.
Yeah.
In fact, more or less killed my career. The nearest I got, and this is really unfortunate, the nearest I got was to rebuilding it at anything like the level I used to be at was I was working for UCL Institute of Education. Specifically, there was a research centre run by a friend of mine, Dr. Farid Panjwani, and It was the Centre for Research in Education in Muslim Contexts.
Okay.
So that could be, in the UK, it doesn't have to be Islamic education. Any education encounter involving people who are Muslim or Muslim heritage or Muslim background. They didn't have to be believers or anything,
Yeah.
Or obviously internationally. And we got this really wicked consultancy project with a Quango in Singapore, and it was the Singapore Islamic Society or so. Anyway, yeah. Majmat is an Arabic name, but it wasn't Arabic, it's Singaporean because it's Islamic. They got an Arabic.
Right. Yes. Adopted that.
And the idea was that because Singapore's a very diverse country,
Right.
micro state like Bahrain, smaller than Bahrain. So you have Chinese population, you have Malay populations, you have Indian, Middle Eastern populations. The main Muslim population are people of Malay heritage, 90-odd% Muslim.
Okay.
And so what they used to do for Islamic studies is send people off to the Middle East, and Singapore, being the kind of place that Singapore is, wasn't very happy about doing that, given the instability and given Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The last thing they want to do is have radicalised Islamic studies students bring it back to Singapore.
Right.
So the idea was to launch a brand new postgraduate college in Singapore, delivering what they had done in they'd gone out to study in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And the idea was that a lot of that Islamic studies curriculum, typically people who went on to that program would have been imams or religious practitioners.
Oh, right.
Judges, perhaps.
Yes. And that's the last thing that the Singaporeans wanted?
No. They've had them. I mean, it's part of the Singapore community. They just didn't want them trained in the young, perhaps potentially impressionable people.
Oh, I see.
Trained in the Middle East while, it was.
So they wanted kind of
bring it all
more modern.
The same Islamic studies curriculum, which would have been usul al-din and fiqh and Arabic language and that, obviously, that they would have had in the Middle East, but delivered in Singapore under the watchful eye of the Singapore authorities.
Right. So there was this opportunity to go to Singapore.
Yeah,
is that right?
Yeah. As part of the consultancy I was doing for UCL, and an innovative aspect of that is they wanted to have elements in the curriculum derived from the humanities and social sciences. And the rationale for that, which I think was quite good, was that people would graduate as postgraduate qualified Islamic studies people, potential religious practitioners with a ijaza, permission to practice as a
sabbatical.
No, ijaza till it's the certificate that you get when you're qualified to be an imam, or you're qualified to be a qadi, or you're qualified to.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So you'd have that, and that would be overseen by people like, for example, from Al Azhar, who would come over to Singapore and deliver that.
Yeah.
But the idea of the humanities and social sciences aspect of it was that students would graduate equipped with all the Islamiyat, but also intellectually equipped in such a way as to enable them to better understand how their faith was socially rooted, how their faith was part of a diverse community, to give them the intellectual tools to critique extremist narratives, to enhance their intercommunal and cross-cultural communication skills, within Singapore and internationally.
Yeah.
So you had that significant humanities and so secular significant humanities and social sciences aspect. So the college was Now, it was good consultancy. It was very well paid and no expenses spared while you're over there. And I thought, oh, I can do this and it will, get me back to where I was. And, okay, all those bad days are behind me with the mental health and everything else.
Yes.
And lo and behold, the pandemic started.
Oh.
There's no international travel. The degree of kind of, quite intimate conversations, two-way conversations that really Zoom wouldn't do. You had to be there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you had to meet people and go to the communities where they lived and all that kind of thing. And obviously COVID had economic impacts, and the Singapore government pulled the plugs on it for the indefinite future. So that was the last. Other than that, I just do bits of, I apply for academic roles when they come up, but I'm quite happy to do, bits of part-time work, cover work, maybe continue to do a bit of academic publishing, going into a different area. It's interesting. I think the only universities that have Gulf studies are, I think it's Durham, Exeter, and Oxford, I'm pretty sure, specifically dedicated postgraduate Gulf studies and research institutes. Other places research the Gulf, obviously, but dedicated. But you go to those centres and it's the Al-Qasimi Centre for this and it's the Al-Sabah Centre for that, and I don't think they want someone like me. Because they fund the centre.
Right, and because maybe, is it something that happened in Bahrain? Is there something?
Yeah, because it would be, critical Gulf studies by someone who was actually there, not just to visit, but actually lived there.
Right.
And who's written critically about what happened. I think in theory, a university, takes a philanthropic donation, and when the money's handed over, it's up to the university precisely what they do with it.
Yes.
In reality, it's not quite like that.
Right. Yeah.
So it's to do with that sort of interpenetration between.
But why wouldn't they want you? I didn't quite understand.
Because I don't think that I think they could tolerate critical voices. And I know a friend of mine.
So you've become known? Is that...
Yeah, a friend of mine who's actually specialised in Gulf studies was effectively hounded out of Durham.
Right.
Just life made unpleasant. He went off to work, I think, at Leiden in the Netherlands.
Yes. I'm sure Durham would have its own view.
They've got its own view. Yeah, of course. But it doesn't make life difficult.
Yes.
You're made to be aware that certain aspects of your research aren't appreciated, given classes you don't want to teach, what in employment law terms would be called constructive dismissal.
I was very impressed when we became acquainted with your writing. You're very, very knowledgeable on the Middle East, which is why I invited you here. Yes.
I'd like to think that over the decades and that I'm reasonably knowledgeable in a variety of different areas, So,
what I'm very modestly,
what I'm trying to do in the latter part of my life, I'm 63 now. What I'm trying to do, really, is kind of move towards being a writer of one sort or another. So that could be sort of informed comment journalism. Journalism around the Middle East, perhaps, various forms of creative writing.
I remember we had a discussion about the origin of the word shawarma, and shawarma.
Oh yes,
shawarma.
Yeah.
And you went into incredible detail about it.
I think I have that kind of associative mind. If you see what I mean, it's not every. You can be a very linear thinker, or you can be a very associative thinker.
Right.
So when I saw the Persian paintings up here,
yes,
straight away that's what have we got there? We've got a dervish, you've got a mullah, you've got someone making a gesture of supplication.
Yes.
You've got the saqi with his flask of wine, presumably. It's autumn, there's fruit on the trees. And, and you can, it looks like it might be just outside of Tehran. And, it's that kind of associative world.
Yeah.
And academia likes to give a lot of lip service to interdisciplinary studies, but a lot of it is only really kind of lip service.
Right.
You end up being branded a jack of all trades, whereas I think it's actually to your advantage that you got detailed area knowledge of an important part of the world, of its economic and historical context, that you know something about education, that you know something about literature, that that broad-based thing. And so, sometimes I regret the amount of time I did put into academia.
Yeah.
I mainly did the PhD. That people ask, what mountain climbers, why do they climb Everest? Well, because it's there. Having gone to university as a mature student, I thought, well, I'll follow this as far as I can. So, which is why I did the doctorate. I didn't particularly want to be an academic, but I thought it would give me some useful research skills, expand my knowledge while I'm doing it. And I kind of drifted into academia. Looking back at my life, I kind of wished I'd put more effort into kinds of writing other than academic writing that tends to be read by quite small audiences, and which your use of language, your structuring of an argument, it's very often depends on the discipline. It varies from discipline to discipline, but often it's very formulaic.
Yes.
And you sort of justify virtually every statement you make with quite elaborate referencing systems, which is fine, makes sense. I'm not saying it's bad, but I wish I'd devoted more of my time looking back to sort of freer kinds of writing, which is what I want to kind of explore.
Yeah. You've got a few blogs running, two I think.
Yeah, I've got one is I said right at the beginning that I dropped out of sixth form for punk,
right,
that came out of an incident in 1976 where I saw a friend of mine, very close friend of mine, and another friend on the back of his motorbike. We both had bikes. I've been a lifelong biker. Killed in front of my eyes in a head-on at high speed. And back in those days, I don't think there wasn't any question of counselling, and it's all sort of get on with it, whatever, probably a hangover still in the 1970s from the Second World War. Teachers and that, all that's what happens with you lads. Let that be a lesson to the rest of you. This is what happens when you mess around on motorbikes.
Yeah, exactly. That's how it was. Yeah.
And I think I've always been probably more prone to than other people to kinds of mental health issues.
Right.
And also quite sensitive, and also quite attuned to life and death and the arbitrary way that things can happen. In Bahrain, I think, having witnessed that again, that I think my underlying vulnerability come from that incident in 76, and then revisiting that in a different political way in Bahrain kind of affected me very deeply. So I dropped out of sixth form college for punk, and in 76, and I ended up doing a punk fanzine.
Right.
That was
back then.
That was ended up being sold very, very well. And I gave up with things like record reviews and gig reviews and all that, band interviews.
Because your dad owned music stores.
He had a small chain of record stores in South London, which is kind of, and he was all punk and that, but he was long before that. He would get me sort of stuff that didn't sell, which tended to be the sort of edgiest music in the first half of the 70s and stuff. So I was primed with that.
Fantastic.
And so that was very successful, and I stopped doing that in the early 80s because I thought I'd moved away from band interviews and gig and album reviews into something that the musical element would have been like a flexi disc or a compact cassette by a band, emerging band at the time, and the rest of the content kind of tried to reflect in prose and poetry and prose poetry and collage, the sort of the ethos and the politics and the aesthetics of anarcho-punk, anarchist punk, which is what I was into. So anyway, I've sort of revived one of those as an online thing.
Oh, brilliant!
And that's one blog I do.
Yeah.
And at the moment, I don't want it just to be nostalgia from 40 odd years ago. What I want to do is try to make the concept work for my present.
Right.
Although there are links to old stuff.
Yeah.
And at the minute, it's quite embryonic, but I'm mainly doing like reviews of films and albums and exhibitions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Just so I can sort of find my feet writing about culture in the 2020s.
Yeah. I really enjoy your blog, actually. It's really well written.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The other one I've got is more specifically about Bahrain.
Right.
And I must remember, I haven't sent you the link for that, because when I got back, I was very active in trying to raise awareness of what happened, because repression in a country that's historically an enemy of the UK, you never hear the end of it. If a country's allied to the West, exactly. I mean, you look at the kind of things that Israel gets,
Sure. Worthy and unworthy victims.
The killable and the unkillable, and it's unfortunate these things that are happening. But look, we're training them. Reforming them. We're helping them to reform, which is ironic because I was out there to work on a reform project in education. So, that's largely about Bahrain, and I used to post on it quite avidly to sort of raise awareness of what was going on, because at first when it happened, Western media did actually report quite a lot on Bahrain, and one of the things the regime did was to hire a number of like very, very big Western PR companies, the kind of companies that will do greenwashing for oil companies and all that sort of thing, to do a strategy that involved keeping them out of the news as much as possible. How to keep what's happening out of the news. How to, the old thing, bury bad news, something. Yeah. You've done something shit in Bahrain. Well, that's how to release how to control the narrative. And the other element of that is sports washing. So you'd have the Grand Prix in Bahrain and Saudi, and you've got the Qatar World Cup, and you've got, I think there's a Golf Open in Saudi. There's those boxing matches that they did recently in Jeddah, and there's.
So you think the BBC didn't? Didn't cover what happened in Bahrain as much because it's an ally of
the media in general did when it was happening in the early days of it.
Yeah.
The role of the PR companies was how to keep things out of the news, or just keep it out. Just find a different story about Bahrain, or make sure very careful.
Agenda setting.
Yeah, agenda setting. Be very careful which journalists, if any, you let in.
Gatekeeping.
And all that kind of those kind of techniques.
Yes.
And so it very quickly.
And then spin on top of that as well.
Yeah, so for example, the Telegraph, Daily Telegraph, while a lot of this was going on, had a video, an article with a video, like sort of citizen journalism video, right-wing newspaper, and that. And this is the Bahrain police doing a drive-by shooting. So this Jeep goes by, the window comes down, boof boof like that, and the car speeds away.
Yeah.
So the initially the media coverage of that was quite fair, whereas now you try to find that on the Telegraph's website and it just doesn't exist.
So was it wiped?
I don't know what they've done with it, but
Yeah.
they've deleted that. A couple of journalists I knew who were interested in Bahrain initially, BBC, one of them, gradually got cold feet and was less and less enthusiastic about talking about it, and eventually got a job somewhere else. There was a US journalist who I think, I need to look her up, I think at the time was working for CNN in country, and was subject to arrest with threats of sexual abuse, and even though she's a US citizen, and released, and her experiences really screwed her up, and she went through a period of mental health issues.
So what's happened now in Bahrain?
What happened immediately after the uprising is that they tried to continue, through the resistance in the villages, but gradually it's a very, very one-sided struggle, and eventually that was more or less snuffed out, and the level of surveillance there now of all kinds is extremely high, and it's very risky to do anything. Apart from a number of supposed reforms, nothing's really changed. I mean, there are still, I think 36 or 37 people on death row in Bahrain. Very largely on either trumped up charges or charges that were extracted under torture.
So it's still going on.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop, really.
It doesn't stop, and occasionally there are protests here. There's a couple of advocacy groups, Bahraini-run advocacy groups in London, because Britain's always been good at that. Lenin lived in London at one point. You keep if anything did change, you've got for example, I mean, it's one of many, Garibaldi and so it's Marx, of course, yeah. So it's very much at that level of kind of sort of advocacy. It's something, believe it or not, I don't have that much to do with at the moment, because I think I've probably said most of what I would like to say about it in that sense, and it has been quite a traumatic set of experiences. I learned a lot about myself, some of it good, some of it not so good.
Right.
My own limitations, the limitations of my own agency, the degree of stamina and fortitude I have or don't have to persist with things. It's a lot of really tough life lessons. I think I think I'd probably like to revisit it as creative writing.
Yeah. Okay.
As a form of novel.
Absolutely.
I've got several ideas of how that might be done.
Right.
I mean, something could be explicitly set in Bahrain, or it could be, how can I put it? Something that's, completely fantasy, but the way like Gulliver's Travels is not about British expansion in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, right.
It's about Lilliput.
Right.
And there's that whole tradition in modern Arabic literature.
Yeah.
Of writing about something that's ostensibly a story in a village, or a long time a Yawmin min al-Ayyam and all the rest of it, and in fact it's about now.
Right. An allegory.
Allegorical. That's the word I was looking for. So something that's allegorical. I mean, I'm in terms of sort of my interest with sort of more journalistic writing, I'm kind of like more interested in what's happening in the UK now.
Yeah.
Because, it was an old Clash song, was it? back in my garage with my bullshit detector, and so my bullshit detector, as is like ultra sensitive.
It's quite high at the moment. Isn't
Yeah,
it?
and if you experience dictatorship, and if you experience media manipulation, disinformation, if you experience revolution and counter-revolution and martial law, if you've had experiences that at least get close to what it's like to be a refugee, if you've lived quite large chunks of your life in areas such as the Middle East, somewhere else it could be, I don't know, Latin America or whatever, you can never look at the news reportage from those places with the assumption, any kind of assumption of like innocence or pure objectivity, no matter how authoritative the news source, because of the way editorial decisions are made and patterns of ownership and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so having had that set of life experiences, when I see, people being stripped of citizenship here, or draconian laws against trade unions or against demonstrations, where the police can ban it and throw you inside for 3 years.
Yeah.
If a demonstration is deemed to be a nuisance or annoying.
Yes.
When you see that kind of thing happen.
Yeah.
And you start to see the tactics of repressive regimes reproduced here.
Yeah.
Because bear in mind, Britain historically is not innocent of that sort of stuff. I mean, the reason these things happen in other parts of the world is because we develop those techniques here, and we're quite capable of using them here if we have to.
Exactly. Exactly.
Without the checks and balances. I mean, in my life, I've always had a sort of love-hate relationship with the United States. But without the degree of openness and checks and balances that you'll get over there.
Yeah.
In what's a very, very centralised political system.
Right. Well, Americans, I love American culture, but a lot of Americans are very critical of the government. A lot more critical than British people of their government.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. And it's a bigger country. It's more diverse. There are bigger political checks and balances on the executive. You have a clear separation of powers. State governments have quite a lot of autonomy over all kinds of issues.
Most Americans now are hypercritical of their government.
Rightly so, and we tend not to see this here. It's like this, you still have this thing that, no matter how bad things, there are times when the country literally looks like it's falling to bits.
Yeah.
Not even the things that people immediately come to mind, like, the NHS or the education system, or, just, things like potholes in the road and flooding.
I saw a funny French cartoon. It characterises English people as sleeping turnips.
Oh, really? Yeah.
How French is that?
Yeah, definitely. I can see that. Definitely. It's the,
because they're not, well, I suppose there are the strikes now, but they're not as politically conscious, should we say?
Well, it's a very low overall. I mean, it's a sweeping generalisation, and it varies between different parts of the country.
And there are different periods.
Urban and rural, and different periods of history. And but generally it's a very low level of political consciousness, and combined, I think, very dangerously with this very reactionary nostalgia for an empire, which is an empire that a lot of the people, even though they're now in this older voters, are actually, even though they're older voters, they aren't really old enough to remember it.
Exactly. It's the idea of the empire versus the reality.
And a misremembered war.
Right. Yeah.
And it's a very dangerous combination. I think that the lost empire. I mean, you can think of Russia with Putin. You can think of Turkey with Erdogan. The
golden past.
The golden past.
So cool.
The world was in our grasp, and through whatever reason we let it slip through our fingers, and all we have to do is go back to whatever, and we'll be back where we were.
And the suspicious mustachioed foreigner.
You have to say, for this is it. You see, no matter how much shit people in this country take in their daily lives, whether it's wages declining in real terms for more than a decade. house price inflation, because what's happened now is a whole generation's been priced out of property just so that an older generation whose incomes were declining can feel richer than they really are because of, I don't know, equity release on an overpriced house or something, and all the chickens are coming home to roost, and now, you only have to, wave a Union Jack about or shout immigrant and, immigrant, where? No, never mind about the hospitals.
Interestingly, an egg was thrown at the sovereign twice, 2 eggs, 2 different occasions.
Yeah, I saw that, and it's
Didn't happen before, did it?
No, not very.
Previous monarch.
I think of the monarchy. I'm a big advocate of constitutional reform because I think what we have, the Westminster system, obviously first past the post system, but other aspects of it as well. I could charitably describe as proto-democratic. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Yes.
or perhaps less generously as crypto-dictatorial.
Really, as far as that.
Because once the boil is swelled so much that it's about to burst,
Yes.
then what you do is position the main opposition party, the Labour Party, and put it in such a position that it has no choice really but to absorb great chunks of the right's agenda.
Right, and that's what happened with UKIP. And the Conservative Party.
And that's what happened with Blair. What was participating
Blair and Thatcher
in the invasion of Iraq? What was that if it wasn't, make Britain great again? Oh, look, we can send armies off to the Middle East.
Yeah, it's grandstanding. Very interesting. I should invite you back.
Oh yeah, it'd be a pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you for coming on.
Okay, thanks a lot then, Ramsey. It's been a great pleasure.
Absolutely. And we should talk about British politics.
Or literature or art or something.
There's so much to talk about.
Definitely.
But this has been really, really good chat.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks so much for coming.
Good pleasure. Bye.